Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Chengxu Zhuang. I'm currently an ICoN Postdoctoral Fellow at MIT, working with Fedorenko and Jacob Andreas. Today, I will talk about neural network models of visual learning and development. Now, let me start by telling you something about jigsaw puzzles. The game is simple. You just try to recover the picture from its pieces, but even simple games have some general strategies to play. For example, in this video, the person recording it are actually actively grouping things according to the visual appearance of the pieces. After the grouping is finished, the person will then match the small pieces corresponding to the image on this different on the original picture to determine where the position should ultimately be. So these are the two general strategies I talked about in solving the jigsaw puzzles: causally grouping things and fine-grained matching them to the original picture. Both of them are finished by the visual system. And we know that learning is actually important for the visual system. We know that from earlier foundation work by Drs. Hubel and Wiesel, and also more recent work where people have found that seeing faces is necessary for face patch formation in primates. The question that I'm going to talk about in this talk is how to model this learning and the development trajectory. So what do we know about this trajectory? We know that children perceive varying stimuli during development. These are images taken from children from their head cameras, and the age of the recording was labeled on the top of the images. So to represent this, I will use this real-world data stream, but with varying color to indicate that it's changing across the time. So as a result, the dynamics are very complex and longitudinal. Different people may have different dynamics, and even averaging them to get to the dynamics average across people, there's still dynamics happening at the different time scales. In fact, the development in the time scale of years, which is what's plotted right now, should be a result of the development in the time scale of hours, which I would call the shown as the real-time dynamics. So how can we model all these different levels of dynamics? What I'm going to show you is that deep neural networks will have the potential to model the whole dynamics. So before doing that, let me first give you a brief introduction to these networks. So visual deep neural networks, for example, typically receive inputs in the very raw forms, meaning images in high-dimensional arrays of pixels. After layers of nonlinear transformations, early layer of this network will have low-level information like edges and contours, while higher layers will have more semantically meaningful information and will typically be lower dimensional. These networks are typically trained to categorize objects. The input image will have an output label produced by these networks, and these labels will be compared to the ground truth label provided by together with the image, and the difference between these two will be used to update the weights. So why am I saying that deep neural networks are good candidates for modeling the dynamics? Let me list the reasons for that. First reason, as I have mentioned in the introduction, they can process data that are similar to what humans process. That makes them available of capturing intermediate, individual level dynamics when different people see different things, and they can capture all these dynamics. Second, which is a more recent finding, is that after being trained to categorize these objects, these networks are similar to the ventral visual pathway of adults. Now, what I mean by this is that the intermediate layers of this network can accurately predict neuronal responses in the ventral visual stream of primates, including early area V1, intermediate area V4, and the downstream area IT. Similar findings have also been shown on human brain responses, and the models can also capture some aspects of human visual behaviors. Now, it's important to mention that these models have not captured all signatures of the ventral visual pathway, but they are much better than other candidates. So all these taken together, deep neural networks might be similar to the adult ventral visual pathway. What might be sometimes overlooked is that these models also have a learning trajectory that can possibly model the development trajectory. However, as was indicated here, these two trajectories are still very different. So in this talk, I will talk about how we can now build ecologically plausible models that can learn from the same data stream as children and adults perceive, and then develop just like them. Now, the overall takeaway from this talk is that I identified a new family of unsupervised learning algorithms called contrastive learning algorithms, yield accurate models of the ventral visual stream. And even when trained on noisy real-world data, these algorithms still work well in modeling the visual system. They also capture some of the lifelong and the real-time learning dynamics, but not the more recent algorithms without the contrasting algorithm design. Now, before going into the actual things, let me first tell you about why the current learning of these networks are wrong. These are the non-typical issues at the time when I started working on this, and there are really three critical issues that I'm going to lay out for you. Now, the first issue is that, and also the biggest issue is that they require many more labels during training than humans. What I mean by this is that the models receive actually 1.2 million labels from the dataset that they are trained on, which is ImageNet. Labels are actually critical for them during learning. Without labels, they won't be able to update their weights at all. Meanwhile, humans have fewer labels. These are like real-world images taken from the children's perspectives, and most of them won't have the labels provided. The second issue is that they are not trained on the correct data. For example, ImageNet has many instances of the same category, and also most of the instances will be static images. But infants perceive fewer instances, and they are dynamic in the temporal axis. The third issue is that they are trained in an offline fashion, meaning that the data will be repeatedly presented to the models to train them. I'll talk more about this later. Now, I have just identified three critical issues in the learning of these models. Next, I'm going to talk about three projects that I and other people have done, each of them addressing one of the critical issues. So the first issue is the requirement of labels. Now, getting rid of labels is actually not as easy as it sounds. It requires a totally new learning algorithm, which figures out what the output of the network now means and how the weights should be updated. These algorithms are called unsupervised learning algorithms. But at the time when I started looking into this problem, these algorithms are generally not good enough. So just to be specific, these 5 algorithms are the algorithms that I have tested, all published in top journals or conferences. Let me give you a concrete example on what the algorithms actually will do. For example, this is an algorithm called colorization. And the way this algorithm works is that it will have the grayscale image input to the network. And the network is trying to predict the per pixel color information, and then compare this output to the ground truth label, and then using this difference to update their weights. So for people who are interested in understanding how humans learn, this algorithm seems a little bit weird, because we humans don't just go around and label the color for things. This is indeed one of the reasons why these earlier algorithms are just not good enough. They're not good enough in the visual tasks, which I'm not going into detail, but feel free to check my publication on this. More importantly, they are really not good enough to model the visual system. Let me show you what this means. So to show this, I will first train these models on ImageNet without the labels using the corresponding loss defined by all these algorithms. After being trained, these networks will then be used to predict the neuronal responses in the non-human primates, including all the three areas I mentioned, V1, V4, and IT in the ventral visual pathway. Just to give you more details about this neuronal response dataset, the input images are 3D objects in front of nature backgrounds that are independent of the objects. The neuronal responses were taken from primates watching at the images in a passive way, meaning that there are no tasks required for the primates. And the prediction is done by training a linear regression on some training images and then evaluated on held out images. So I will first look at the predictivity on the IT area. The metric that we will look at is noise-corrected correlation between predicted and the ground truth neural responses. Higher is better, and the highest is 1. Here, the black bar represents the supervised model, and the brown bar represents a model that's totally untrained. What we can see here is that the supervised model achieves good predictivity on predicting IT neural responses, and is much better than the untrained model. So how do these earlier unsupervised learning algorithms work in this benchmark? What we can see is that they are really not good enough. There is a very significant gap between all these blue bars and the black bar. In the recent years, there have been a new family of unsupervised learning methods called contrastive learning algorithms. The general idea of these algorithms is actually very similar to what we have seen in the jigsaw puzzle, which is that it wants to group the input images in their populations. But now the grouping is happening in the high-level representation. Now, what I mean by this? Just to give you an example, for example, the image will be sampled to generate multiple views of the same image. Here's one possible view, and these are different views. And the training algorithm will then require these different views to generate similar representations in the high level, meaning that the embedding of these views should be similar. Here, embedding is just a word for the low dimension representation that's outputted at the high layer of the network. But grouping is not just putting things together, because grouping actually implicitly requires multiple groups, right? This is the second component in this loss definition, where it also separates the current embedding from other embeddings that are from different images. However, after looking at this, one thing that's a little bit weird to us would be there are actually images in these other inputs that are similar to the image that are the current inputs. Why would you separate things that are actually very semantically similar? This is exactly the point that we took to develop our new algorithm called the local aggregation. So in this algorithm, we aim to semantically aggregate inputs. So how this is done? We will first look at the embedding space. This is just schema for that, including the embeddings of all possible images. The red dots, for example, here indicate the embedding for the current image. And what we will do then is to group the embeddings separate the embeddings into different groups. For example, the blue dots here represents close neighbors that are very similar to the current input in this embedding space. And the black dots represents background neighbors that are similar but not that similar, while the gray dots represent other neighbors. This algorithm will then try to aggregate the representations of the current input and the other views, including the close neighbors, and also separate it from the background neighbors, while other neighbors will not be used. In doing this, it's forcing the embedding to be semantically meaningful and also close to the heart, to the semantically close, similar embeddings instead of just being farther away from all the other inputs. At the time when this algorithm was published, it achieved the best results when trained on ImageNet, and it was also the first algorithm that surpasses the supervised AlexNet, which was the key architecture that triggered the whole deep learning revolution. So it really represents a milestone in the unsupervised learning algorithms. So how do these algorithms work? In predicting the neural responses in the ventral visual pathway, here we will still look at the IT area. What we can see is that contrastive learning algorithms achieve better IT predictivity than the earlier algorithms and are now much comparable to the supervised model. But supervised model also achieves good predictivity in other areas, including V4 and V1. How do the contrastive learning algorithms work there? In fact, local aggregation also achieves high predictivity in V1 and V4. In V4, local aggregation is actually better than other contrastive learning algorithms. In V1, they are all comparable to the supervised model. Local aggregation also yields correct anatomical mapping, meaning that the earlier layer of this model better predicts V1 area, and the intermediate layer of this model better predicts V4 area, and the later layer of this model better predicts IT area. So this, together with the earlier results, really suggests that this model has the potential to explain not just the development of the last layer like IT, but also the developmental trajectory of the intermediate layer and also the earlier layers. So what I have just talked about in this in this project is that the ventral visual pathway may learn and develop like contrastive learning algorithms. In the next project, I will talk about how the algorithms can now use data that are less wrong. So what I mean by this is that in the previous project, the models might be similar to the adult representations, but they are still trained on a data set that's very different from what children actually receive during their development. Just to remind you how different they are, models see the span instances and the static images, while infants, they see fewer instances and are dynamic. So to capture what the children are actually seeing during their development, we use this child viewpoint dataset called ICoN. This dataset is collected by 3 children by having had cameras on 3 children aged from 6 to 32 months, and from the viewpoints of their head-mounted cameras, and each child will roughly receive collect 2 hours per week, and in total there are 600 hours. It's still a small collection of what the children actually see during development, but it's a good sample of the actual visual statistics. Our next question is then how to develop visual system-like representations from this data set. So intuitively, you may think that now the videos will include the additional information, which is the temporal information, and this should make the learning easier. However, it's actually not easy at all to use this temporal information well. For example, a very popular hypothesis about leveraging the temporal information is predictive coding, implemented by this PredNet algorithm. This algorithm will take the input image as a previous frame, and then will use that image to predict the next frame in the video sequence. So how does this algorithm work in expanded neural responses in V4 and IT? So what we will look at is still this non-human primate data, but being adult-like in the ventral visual stream typically requires also being good on this benchmark. After evaluating this algorithm, what we find is that there is a significant gap between the PredNet and the supervised model. So in the previous project, I used these contrastive learning algorithms. How about just running them on the still frames without using any temporal information? What we can see is that local aggregation actually bridges much of the gap, although it underuses the temporal information. So how to further bridge the gap by leveraging the temporal information? To understand how this can be done, let's look at some examples in the ICoN videos. For example, the children may look at the similar object from different viewpoints in one video sequence. At different video sequences, they may look at different objects, and different children may look at different things, but the same child may look at similar things across even years' lifespan. This indicates that learning from real kids' data is really a harder problem than learning from ImageNet, because there is this long-range temporal dependency of hours or years. There are many fewer distinct examples, but there will be from a wider variety of viewpoints. This is exactly the point we took to develop our new algorithm. We leverage temporal information to decide what to aggregate and what to separate. And we will aggregate the viewpoints of the same object happening in one video sequence, but separate them from different video sequences. We developed this algorithm called video instance embedding. There is a different stream of this model that leverage the temporal information using temporal convolution, which I'm not going into the details, and is also not used in this project. But at the time of this algorithm being published, it achieved the best results by very large margins in action recognition task and image categorization task. So VIE also outperforms the previous still frames model local aggregation by leveraging the temporal information in videos. As you can see, there is a significant gap between the green and the VIE bar. However, there is still some gap between training on ImageNet and the training on ICoN. So we still have some work that we need to do. Now, this is second project where I just talked about how temporal information can be used. And this indicates that the ventral visual pathway may leverage the temporal information by aggregating multiple views of the same item. So in these two projects, I talked about developing better AI algorithms. They also lead to better models for the ventral visual stream. Does this mean that better unsupervised learning algorithms from the AI community are always more human-like? There are, in fact, many new unsupervised learning algorithms. I'm just listing some of them here. However, in the next project, I will show you that this is not the case. So in the next project, I will talk about how to do human-like online learning. Now, let me first talk about why offline learning is wrong. Mentioned that offline learning represents a meaning that the same data will be repeatedly presented to the models. It will generate some trajectory, but if we look at the intermediate point of this trajectory, they are really not comparable because, for example, at this point, children have seen the first 20% of the data in the stream, but the models have repeatedly seen all the data 20 times. There is just no way that these two trajectories can be comparable. In addition to that, online learning is also required for a general model of the development dynamics in different timescales. This is a development scale, like in the lifelong scale in years. There is another time scale, which is in the real time scale in hours. So a correct model should also capture the dynamics in both these two time scales. So how can we do that? We will first show the videos that children received during their development in the same order to the models. Here, the epoch number meaning the presentation order to the models. Within one epoch, we will also show the frames captured in this video to the same order that they are recorded to the models. Here, the step number meaning that the presentation order to the models. So our aim is then to have the same algorithm to model the learning dynamics in both timescales. But only learning from the current context, but this is actually not a simple task because if you only learn from the current context, like just sample from it and learn from it, you will quickly lose your progress on earlier inputs. This is why we developed a memory storage system, and we store all the earlier inputs as memory, and we jointly learn from memory and the current context. Now the memory is still implemented in very simple form, which is that we store all the earlier inputs and then we randomly draw samples from it. But we expect that making it more like human memory system will also make the learning better. So I've just talked about models need to have a memory module, but only learning from this memory will also lead to failure in adapting to the real-time changes. So this really indicates a trade-off between real-time and lifelong learning on how much memory should be used. In fact, how memory is used is also a critical design point that vary in the learning algorithms. I talked about there were many new unsupervised learning algorithms, and they differ in a critical way in how memory is used. And it's interesting that they actually differ in a systematic way, that earlier algorithms actively separate one example from others in the memory, which we call the contrasting mechanism. But recent algorithms no longer doing that. They removed this contrasting mechanism and just doing embedding aggregation. And as you can imagine, these recent algorithms outperformed the earlier ones on typical computer vision benchmarks like ImageNet. But how do these algorithms model human learning dynamics? To answer that, we will look at the modeling dynamics in both real-time and lifelong timescales. In real time, we will look at the mismatch to human learning dynamics measured in another experiment. Let me briefly talk about how this is done. In this experiment, human subjects will iteratively go through test and exposure phases. In the exposure phase, they will be asked to just click the dot when it appears. And then in this condition, for example, when two faces are used, there will be different faces. Hopefully you can see them. And in another condition, there will be the same faces. So when they look at the different faces, they will be further asked to which was in the test phase. And as you can imagine, the different faces will lead to decreasing accuracy. Same faces will lead to an increasing accuracy, which is captured in this figure. And so again, we are trying to model these learning dynamics, and what we're going to look at is a mismatch score where lower is better and the lowest is 1.0. So the algorithms that are not doing memory contrasting actually do not so well on this benchmark. They are significantly higher than the lowest amount. And if we look at the actual learning dynamics, for example, this algorithm barely captures the learning dynamics, while this algorithm captures some, but not too much. So the algorithms, however, the algorithms doing memory contrasting actually do much better. They consistently outperform the algorithms without contrasting on this benchmark. And if you look at one of them, they captured most of the dynamics, though not all of them. This is only on one time scale of the learning dynamics. How about the lifelong time scale? Now remember that in this evaluation, the models will be trained on the videos that children perceive during their development. And what we will look at is then the categorization accuracy averaged across the learning trajectories. And here, higher is better, and we use this as a proxy for human likeness. What we can see is that when evaluated on this, algorithms without memory contrasting really mostly failed on this time scale. Although there is one algorithm that does not so bad, this algorithm totally failed in the real-time benchmark. This is the MAE algorithm that's actually the most popular unsupervised learning algorithm right now. But the algorithms with contrasting consistently outperformed algorithms without contrasting. If we put them together, this really indicates that we cannot simply wait for AI advances. The recent AI algorithms really diverge from being more human-like because the recent algorithms have already removed this memory contrasting mechanism. Earlier, I mentioned that there is a trade-off between these two time scales. What I'm going to show is that with the same model, if you use less memory, the real-time learning dynamics will be worse. But if you use more memory, the lifelong learning dynamics will be worse. But if you use more memory, the real-time learning dynamics is worse. So this is captured in this figure. Okay, so what I have just shown in this project is that the ventral visual pathway may leverage memory for learning and developing in both year-long and hour-long time scale. However, you should not just use the recent AI algorithms. So in this talk, we started from having these three critical issues in the learning of visual deep neural networks: requirement of labels, not trained on correct data, and training in this offline fashion. Through my works on building stronger learning algorithms and also linking them to the ventral visual pathway, and also building the real-time learning and the lifelong learning dynamics, we are now much closer to using these models to model the whole development trajectory. Of course, this is still not the end. For example, humans develop multiple modalities simultaneously. So in the future, we want to integrate the development of other modalities like language and addition. At the same time, these models should also be better models of neural responses from developing visual systems, like infant visual cortex responses. Finally, we also want to build models with more inductive bias, like we know that humans represent objects in special way, so we want to integrate that in the models and track how they will improve the modeling of the dynamics in the trajectories. At last, I want to thank the people who I have worked with on this project. Without their help, these projects will really not be available. And thank you all for your attention. Feel free to check the publications and also contact me if you have questions.